Hi, this is Gregor from Scottish Reading ASMR. I'm going to be reading Rage by Richard Bachman, chapters 11 to 15. Take your time now to adjust your volume, get comfy, and enjoy. 11. If someone had screamed something melodramatic at that precise moment, something like, "Oh my God, he's going to kill us all," it would have been over right there. They would have bolted like sheep, and somebody aggressive like Dick Keane would have belted me over the head with his algebra book, thereby earning a key to the city and the Good Citizenship Award. But nobody said a word. They sat in utter stunned silence, looking at me actively as if I had just announced that I was going to tell them how they could all get passes to the Placerville Drive-In this Friday night. I shut the classroom door, crossed the room, and sat behind the big desk. My legs weren't so good. I was almost on the point of sit down or fall down. I had to push Mrs. Underwood's feet out of the way to get my own feet into the knee hole. I put the pistol down on her green blotter, shut her algebra book, and put it with the others that were stacked neatly on the desk's corner. That was when Irma Bates broke the silence with a high gobbling scream that sounded like a young tom turkey getting its neck wrung on the day before Thanksgiving. But it was too late. Everyone had taken that endless moment to consider the facts of life and death. Nobody picked up on her scream, and she stopped, as if ashamed at screaming while school was in session, no matter how great the provocation. Somebody cleared his throat. Somebody in the back of the room said, "Hum," in a mildly judicial tone, and John Pigpen Dano slithered quietly out of his seat and slumped to the floor in a dead faint. They looked up at me from the trough of shock. "This," I said pleasantly, "is known as getting it on." Footsteps pounded down the hall, and somebody asked somebody else if something had exploded in the chemistry lab. While somebody else was saying he didn't know, the fire alarm went off stridently. Half the kids in the class started to get up automatically. "That's all right," I said. "It's just my locker. On fire. I set it on fire, that is. Sit down." The ones that had started to get up sat down obediently. I looked for Sandra Cross. She was in the third row, fourth seat, and she did not seem afraid. She looked like what she was, an intensely exciting good girl. Lines of students were filing out onto the grass. I could see them through the windows. The squirrel was gone, though. Squirrels make lousy but innocent bystanders. The door was snatched open and I picked up the gun. Mr. Vance poked his head in. "Fire alarm," he said. "Everybody..." "Where's Mrs. Underwood?" "Get out," I said. He stared at me. He was a very porky man, and his hair was neatly crew-cut. It looked as if some landscape artist had trimmed it carefully with hedge clippers. "What? What did you say?" "Out!" I shot at him and missed. The bullet whined off the upper edge of the door, chipping wood splinters. "Jesus," somebody in the front row said mildly. Mr. Vance didn't know what was happening. I don't think any of them did. It all reminded me of an article I read about the last big earthquake in California. It was about a woman who was wandering from room to room while her house was being shaken to pieces all around her, yelling to her husband to please unplug the fan. Mr. Vance decided to go back to the beginning. "There's a fire in the building, please." "Charlie's got a gun, Mr. Vance," Mike Gavin said in a discussing the weather tone. "I think you better..." The second bullet caught him in the throat. His flesh spread liquidly, but like water spreads when you throw a rock in it. He walked backward into the hall, scratching at his throat, and fell over. Irma Bates screamed again, but again she had no takers. If it had been Carol Granger, there would have been imitators galore, but who wanted to be in concert with poor old Irma Bates? She didn't even have a boyfriend. Besides, everyone was too busy peeking at Mr. Vance, whose scratching motions were slowing down. "Ted," I said to Ted Jones, who sat closest to the door, "shut that and lock it." "What do you think you're doing?" Ted asked. He was looking at me with a kind of scared and scornful distaste. "I don't know the details just yet," I said. "But shut the door and lock it, okay?" Down the hall someone was yelling. It's in a locker. It's in a. Hey, Pete Vance has had a heart attack. Get some water. Get. Ted Jones got up, shut the door, and locked it. He was a tall boy wearing wash faded Levi's and an army shirt with flat pockets. He looked very fine. I had always admired Ted, although he was never part of the circle I travelled in. He drove last year's Mustang, which his father had given him, and didn't get any parking tickets either. He combed his hair in an out of fashion DA, and I bet his was the face that Irma Bates called up in her mind when she sneaked a cucumber out of the refrigerator in the wee hours of the night. With an all American name like Ted Jones, he couldn't very well miss either. His father was vice president of Placerville Bank and Trust. Now what? Harmon Jackson asked. He sounded bewildered. I put the pistol down on the blotter again. Well, somebody try and bring Pigpen round. He'll get his shirt dirtier, I mean. Sarah Pastern started to giggle hysterically and clapped her hand over her mouth. George Yannick, who sat close to Pigpen, squatted down beside him and began to pat his cheeks. Pigpen moaned, opened his eyes, rolled them, and said, "He shot book bags." There were several hysterical laughs this time. They went off around the room like popping corn. Mrs. Underwood had 2 plastic briefcases with tartan patterns on them, which she carried into each class. She had also been known as Two Gun Sue. Pigpen settled shakily into his seat, rolling his eyes again, and began to cry. Somebody pounded up to the door, rattled the knob, and yelled, "Hey! Hey in there!" It looked like Mr. Johnson, who had been talking about the Hessians. I picked up the pistol and put a bullet through the chicken wired glass. It made a neat little hole beside Mr. Johnson's head, and Mr. Johnson went out of sight like a crash-diving submarine. The class, with the possible exception of Ted, watched all the action with close interest, as if they had stumbled into a pretty good movie by accident. "Somebody in there's got a gun!" Mr. Johnson yelled. There was a faint bumping sound as he crawled away. The fire alarm buzzed hoarsely on and on. "Now what?" Harmon Jackson asked again. He was a small boy, usually with a big cockeyed grin on his face, but now he looked helpless, all at sea. I couldn't think of an answer to that, so I let it pass. Outside, kids were milling restlessly around on the lawn, talking and pointing at room 16 as the grapevine passed the word among them. After a little bit, some teachers, the men teachers, began shooing them backward toward the gymnasium end of the building. In town, the fire whistle on the municipal building began to scream, rising and falling in hysterical cycles. "It's like the end of the world," Sandra Cross said softly. I had no answer for that either. 12. No one said anything for maybe 5 minutes, not until the fire engines got to the high school. They looked at me and I looked at them. Maybe they still could have bolted, and they're still asking me why they didn't. Why didn't they cut and run, Charlie? What did you do to them? Some of them asked that most fearfully, as if I had the evil eye. I don't answer them. I don't answer any questions about what happened that morning in room 16. But if I told them anything, it would be that they've forgotten what it is to be a kid, to live cheek by jowl with violence, with the commonplace fistfights in the gym, brawls at the PAL hops in Lewiston, beatings on televisions, murders in the movies. Most of us had seen a little girl puke pea soup all over a priest right down at our local drive-in. Old book bags wasn't much shakes by comparison. I'm not taking on any of those things. Hey, I'm in no shape for crusades these days. I'm just telling you that American kids labor under a huge life of violence, both real and make-believe. Besides, I was kind of interested. Hey, Charlie Decker went apeshit today, did you hear? No, did he? Yeah, I was there. It was just like Bonnie and Clyde, except Charlie's got zitsies and there wasn't any popcorn. I know they thought they'd be all right. That's part of it. What I wonder about is this. Were they hoping I'd get someone else? Another shrieking sound had joined the fire siren, this one getting closer real fast. Not the cops. It was that hysterical yodeling note that is all the latest rage in ambulances and paramedic vehicles these days. I've always thought the day will come when all the disaster vehicles will get smart and stop scaring the almighty shit out of everyone they're coming to save. When there's a fire or an accident or a natural disaster like me, the red vehicles will rush to the scene accompanied by the amplified sound of the Darktown Strutters playing Banjo Rag. Someday. Oh boy. 13. Seeing as how it was the school, the town fire department went whole hog. The fire chief came first, gunning into the semicircular school driveway in his blue bubble-topped Ford Pinto. Behind him was a hook and ladder trailing firemen like battle banners. There were 2 pumpers behind that. You going to let them in? Jack Goldman asked. The fire's out there, I said, not in here. Did you shut your locker door? Sylvia Regan asked. She was a big blonde girl with great soft cardiganed breasts and gently rotten teeth. Yes. Probably out already then. Mike Gavin looked at the scurrying firemen and snickered. 2 of them just ran into each other, he said. Holy moly. The 2 downed firemen untangled themselves, and the whole group was preparing to charge into the inferno when 2 suit-coated figures ran over to them. One was Mr. Johnson, the human submarine, and the other was Mr. Grace. They were talking hard and fast to the fire chief. Great rolls of hose with shiny nozzles were being unreeled from the pumpers and dragged toward the front doors. The fire chief turned around and yelled, "Hold it!" They stood irresolutely on the lawn, their nozzles gripped and held out before them like comic brass phalluses. The fire chief was still in conference with Mr. Johnson and Mr. Grace. Mr. Johnson pointed at room 16. Thomas Denver, the principal with the amazing overshaved neck, ran over and joined the discussion. It was starting to look like a pitcher's mound conference in the last half of the 9th. I want to go home, Irma Bates said wildly. Blow it out, I said. The fire chief had started to gesture towards his knights again, and Mr. Grace shook his head angrily and put a hand on his shoulder. He turned to Denver and said something to him. Denver nodded and ran toward the main doors. The chief was nodding reluctantly. He went back to his car, rummaged in the back seat, and came up with a really nice Radio Shack battery-powered bullhorn. I bet they had some real tussles back at the fire station about who got to use that. Today the chief was obviously pulling rank. He pointed it at the milling students. Please move away from the building. I repeat, will you please move away from the building? Move up to the shoulder of the highway. Move up to the shoulder of the highway. We will have buses here to pick you up shortly. School is cancelled for... Short, bewildered whoop. For the remainder of the day. Now please move away from the building. A bunch of teachers, both men and women this time, started herding them up toward the road. They were craning and babbling. I looked for Joe McKennedy, but didn't see him anywhere. Is it all right to do homework? Melvin Thomas asked tremblingly. There was a general laugh. They seemed surprised to hear it. Go ahead, I thought for a moment and added, if you want to smoke, go ahead and do it. A couple of them grabbed for the pockets. Sylvia Regan, doing her Lady of the Manor bit, fished a battered pack of Camels delicately out of her purse and lit up with leisurely elegance. She blew out a plume of smoke and dropped her match on the floor. She stretched out her legs, not bothering over much with the nuisance of her skirt. She looked comfy. There had to be more, though. I was getting along pretty well, but there had to be 1,000 things I wasn't thinking of. Not that it mattered. If you've got a friend you want to sit next to, go ahead and change around, but don't try and rush at me or run out the door, please. A couple of kids changed next to their buddies, walking quickly and softly, but most of them just sat quiet. Melvin Thomas had opened his algebra book, but couldn't seem to concentrate on it. He was staring at me glassily. There was a faint metallic chink from the upper corner of the room. Somebody had just opened the intercom system. Hello, Denver said. Hello, room 16. Hello, I said. Who's that? Charlie Decker. Long pause. Finally. What's going on down there, Decker? I thought it over. I guess I'm going berserk, I said. An even longer pause. Then almost rhetorically. What have you done? I motioned at Ted Jones. He nodded back at me politely. Mr. Denver? Who's that? Ted Jones. Mr. Denver. Charlie has a gun. He's holding us hostage. He's killed Mrs. Underwood, and I think he killed Mr. Vance too. I'm pretty sure I did, I said. Oh, Mr. Denver said. Sarah passed her and giggled again. Ted Jones. I'm here, Ted told him. He sounded very competent. Ted did, but at the same time distant. Like a first lieutenant who'd been to college. You had to admire him. Who was in the classroom besides you and Decker? Just a sec, I said. I'll call the roll. Hold on. I got Mrs. Underwood's green attendance book and opened it up. Period 2, right? Yeah, Corky said. Okay, here we go. Irma Bates. I want to go home, Irma screamed defiantly. She's here, I said. Susan Brooks? Here. Nancy Caskin? Here. I went through the rest of the roll. There were 25 names, and the only absentee was Peter Franklin. Has Peter Franklin been shot? Mr. Denver asked quietly. He's got the measles, Don Lordy said. This brought on another attack of giggles. Ted Jones frowned deeply. Decker? Yes? Will you let them go? Not right now, I said. Why? There was a dreadful concern, a dreadful heaviness in his voice, and for a second I almost caught myself feeling sorry for him. I crushed that quickly. It's like being in a big poker game. Here's this guy who has been winning big all night. He's got a pile of chips that's a mile high, and all at once he starts to lose. Not a little bit, but like a lot. And you want to feel bad for him in his fallen empire, but you cram that back and bust him, or you take it in the eye. So I said, we haven't finished getting it on down here yet. What does that mean? It means stick it, I said. Carol Granger's eyes got round. Decker, call me Charlie. All my friends call me Charlie. Decker. I held my hand up in front of the class and crossed the fingers in pairs. If you don't call me Charlie, I'm going to shoot somebody. Pause. Charlie. That's better. In the back row, Mike Gavin and Dick Keane were covering grins. Some of the others weren't bothering to cover them. You call me Charlie, and I'll call you Tom. That okay, Tom? Long pause. When will you let them go, Charlie? They haven't hurt you. Outside, one of the town's 3 black and whites and a blue state police cruiser had arrived. They parked across the road from the high school, and Jerry Kesserling, the chief since Warren Talbot had retired into the local Methodist cemetery in 1975, began directing traffic onto the Oak Hill Pond Road. Did you hear me, Charlie? Yes, but I can't tell you. I don't know. There are more cops coming, I guess. Mr. Wolfe called them, Mr. Denver said. I imagine there will be a great deal more when they fully appreciate what's going on. They'll have tear gas and mace. Dick, Charlie, why make it hard on yourself and your classmates? Tom, grudgingly. What? You get your skinny, cracked ass out there and tell them that the minute anyone shoots tear gas or anything else in here, I'm going to make them sorry. You tell them to remember who's driving. What, why? Why are you doing this? He sounded angry and impotent and frightened. He sounded like a man who has just discovered there is no place left to pass the buck. I don't know, I said. But it sure beats panty raids, Tom. And I don't think it actually concerns you. All I want you to do is trot back out there and tell them what I said. Will you do that, Tom? I have no choice, do I? No, that's right, you don't. And there's something else, Tom. What? He asked it very hesitantly. I don't like you very much, Tom, as you've probably realised, but up to now you haven't had to give much of a rip how I felt. But I'm out of your filing cabinet now, Tom. Have you got it? I'm not just a record you can lock up at 3 in the afternoon. Have you got it? My voice was rising into a scream. Have you got that, Tom? Have you internalized that particular fact of life? Yes, Charlie, he said in a deadly voice. I have it. No, you don't, Tom. But you will. Before the day's over, we are going to understand all about the difference between people and pieces of paper in a file, and the difference between doing your job and getting jobbed. What do you think of that, Tommy, my man? I think you're a sick boy, Decker. No, you think I'm a sick boy, Charlie. Isn't that what you meant to say, Tom? Yes. Say it. I think you're a sick boy, Charlie, the mechanical, embarrassed rote of a 7-year-old. You've got some getting it on to do yourself, Tom. Now get out there and tell them what I said. Denver cleared his throat as if he had something else to say, and then the intercom clicked off. A little murmur went through the class. I looked them over very carefully. Their eyes were so cool and somehow detached. Shock can do that. You're ejected like a fighter pilot from a humdrum dream of life to a grinding, overloaded slice of the real meat, and your brain refuses to make the adjustment. You can only free fall and hope that sooner or later your chute will open. And a ghost of grammar school came back to me. Teacher, teacher, ring the bell. My lessons all to you I'll tell. And when my day at school is through, I'll know more than aught I knew. I wonder what they were learning today. What I was learning. The yellow school buses had begun to appear, and our classmates were going home to enjoy the festivities on living room TVs and pocket transistor radios, but in room 16, education went on. I rapped the butt of the pistol sharply on the desk. The murmur died. They were watching me as closely as I was watching them. Judge and jury, or jury and defendant, I wanted to cackle. Well, I said, the shit has surely hit the fan. I think we need to talk a little. Private? George Janik asked. Just you and us? He had an intelligent, perky face, and he didn't look frightened. Yes. You better turn off that intercom then. You big-mouthed son of a bitch, Ted Jones said distinctly. George looked at him, wounded. There was an uncomfortable silence while I got up and pushed the little lever below the speaker from talk listen to listen. I went back and sat down again. I nodded at Ted. I was thinking of it anyway, I lied. You shouldn't take on so... Ted didn't say anything, but he offered me a strange little grin that made me think he might have been wondering about how I might taste. Okay, I said to the class at large. I may be crazy, but I'm not going to shoot anyone for discussing this thing with me. Believe it. Don't be afraid to shoot off your mouths, as long as we don't all talk at once. That didn't look as if it was going to be a problem. To take the bull by the horns, is there anyone here who really thinks I'm going to just up and murder them? A few of them looked uneasy, but nobody said anything. Okay, because I'm not. We're just going to sit around and bug the hell out of everybody. Yeah, you sure bugged the hell out of Mrs. Underwood, Ted said. He was still smiling, his strange smile. I had to. I know that's hard to understand, but I had to. It came down to that. And Mr. Vance, but what I want everyone here to take it easy. No one is going to shoot the place up, so you don't have to worry. Carol Granger raised her hand timidly. I nodded at her. She was smart as a whip. Class president and a cinch to speak a piece as valedictorian in June. Our responsibilities to the black race, or maybe hopes for the future. She was already signed up for one of those big league women's colleges where people always wonder how many virgins there are, but I didn't hold it against her. When can we go, Charlie? I sighed and shrugged my shoulders. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. But my mother will be worried to death. Why? Sylvia Reagan asked. She knows where you are, doesn't she? General laugh. Except for Ted Jones. He wasn't laughing, and I was going to have to watch that boy. He was still smiling his small, savage smile. He wanted badly to blow everything out of the water, obvious enough. But why? Insanity prevention merit badge? Not enough. Adulation of the community in general, the boy who stood on the burning deck with his finger in the dike, it didn't seem his style. Handsome, low profile was Ted's style. He was the only guy I knew who had quit the football team after 3 Saturdays of glory in his junior year. The guy who wrote sports for the local rag had called him the best running back Placerville High School had ever produced, but he had quit, suddenly and with no explanation. Amazing enough. What was more amazing was the fact that his popularity quotient hadn't lost a point. If anything, Ted became more the local BMOC than ever. Joe McKennedy, who had suffered through 4 years and one broken nose at left tackle, told me that the only thing Ted would say when the agonised coach demanded an explanation was that football seemed to be a pretty stupid game, and he, Ted, thought that he could find a better way to spend his time. You can see why I respected him, but I was damned if I knew why he wanted me in such a personal way. A little thought on the matter might have helped, but things were going awful fast. Are you nuts? Harmon Jackson asked suddenly. I think it must be, I said. Anyone who kills anyone else is nuts, in my book. Well, maybe you ought to give yourself up, Harmon said. Get some help, a doctor, you know. You mean like that Grace? Sylvie asked. My God, that creepster. I had to go see him after I threw an inkwell at old Lady Green. All he did was look at my dress and try to get me to talk about my sex life. Not that you've had any, Pat Fitzgerald said, and there was another laugh. And not that it's any business of his or yours, she said haughtily, dropped her cigarette on the floor and smashed it. So what are we going to do? Jack Goldman asked. Just get it on, I said. That's all. Out on the lawn, a second town police car had arrived. I guessed that the third one was probably down at Junior's diner taking on vital shipments of coffee and donuts. Denver was talking with a state trooper in blue pants and one of these almost Stetsons they were. Up on the road, Jerry Kesserling was letting a few cars through the roadblock to pick up kids who didn't ride the bus. The cars picked up and then drove hastily away. Mr. Grace was talking to a guy in a business suit that I didn't know. The fireman was standing around and smoking cigarettes and waiting for someone to tell them to put out a fire or go home. Has this got anything to do with you beating up Carlson? Corky asked. How should I know what it has to do with? I asked him irritably. If I knew what was making me do it, I probably wouldn't have to. It's your parents, Susan Brooks spoke up suddenly. It must be your parents. Ted Jones made a rude noise. I looked over at her, surprised. Susan Brooks was one of those girls who never say anything unless called upon, the ones that teachers always have to ask to speak up, please. A very studious, very serious girl. A rather pretty but not terribly bright girl, the kind who isn't allowed to give up and take the general or the commercial courses because she had a terribly brighter older brother or older sister, and teachers expect comparable things from her. In fine, one of those girls who are holding the dirty end of the stick with as much good grace and manners as they can muster. Usually they marry truck drivers and move to the west coast, where they have kitchen nooks with formica counters, and they write letters to the folks back east as seldom as they can get away with. They make quiet, successful lives for themselves and grow prettier as the shadow of the bright older brother or sister falls away from them. My parents, I said, tasting it. I thought about telling them I'd been hunting with my dad when I was 9. My Hunting Trip by Charles Decker, subtitle, or How I Overheard My Dad Explain the Cherokee Nose Job. Too revolting. I snatched a look at Ted Jones and the rich coppery aroma of pay dirt filled my nostrils. His face was set in a furious, jeering expression as if someone had just forced a whole lemon into his mouth and had jammed his jaws together. As if someone had dropped a depth charge into his brains and sent some old sunken hulk into long and ominous psychic vibrations. That's what it says in all the psychology books, Susan was going on, all blithely unaware. In fact, she suddenly became aware of the fact that she was speaking, and in a normal tone of voice, and in class. and climbed up. She was wearing a pale jade-coloured blouse, and her bra straps showed through like ghostly half-erased chalk marks. "My parents," I said again, and stopped again. I remembered the hunting trip again, but this time I remembered waking up, seeing the moving branches on the tight canvas of the tent. Was the canvas tight? You bet it was. My dad put that tent up, and everything he did was tight. No loose screws there. Looking at the moving branches, needing to whiz, feeling like a little kid again, and remembering something that happened long ago. I didn't want to talk about that. I hadn't talked about it with Mr. Grace. This was getting it on for real, and besides, there was Ted. Ted didn't care for this at all. Perhaps it was all very important to him. Perhaps Ted could still be helped. I suspected it was much too late for me, but even on that level, don't they say that learning is good and elegant thing for its own sake? Sure. Outside, nothing much seemed to be going on. The last town police car had arrived, and just as I had expected, they were handing out coffee and story time, chillins. "My parents," I said. 14. My parents met at a wedding reception, and although it may have nothing to do with anything, unless you believe in omens, the bride that day was burned to death less than a year later. Her name was Jessie Decker Hannaford. As Jessie Decker, she had been my mom's roommate at the University of Maine, where they were both majoring in political science. The thing that seemed to have happened was this: Jessie's husband went out to a special town meeting, and Jessie went into the bathroom to take a shower. She fell down and hit her head and knocked herself unconscious. In the kitchen, a dish towel fell on a hot stove burner. The house went up like a rocket. Wasn't it a mercy she didn't suffer? So the only good that came out of that wedding was my mother's meeting with Jessie Decker Hannaford's brother. He was an ensign in the Navy. After the reception, he asked my mother if she would like to go dancing. She said yes. They courted for 6 months, and then they were married. I came along about 14 months after the nuptials, and I've done the math again and again. As near as I can figure, I was conceived on one of the nights just before or just after my father's sister was being broiled alive in her shower cap. She was my mom's bridesmaid. I've looked at all the wedding pictures, and no matter how often I've looked, it always gives me a weird feeling. There was Jessie holding my mother's bridal train, Jessie and her husband, Brian Hannaford, smiling in the background as my mom and dad cut the wedding cake. Jessie dancing with the minister, and in all the pictures she is only 5 months away from the shower and the dish rag on the hot stove burner. You wish you could step into one of those Kodachromes and approach her, say, "You're never going to be my Aunt Jessie unless you stay out of the shower when your husband is away. Be careful, Aunt Jessie." But you can't go back. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost, and all that. But it happened, which is another way of saying I happened, and that's it. I was an only child. My mother never wanted another. She's very intellectual, my mother. Reads English mysteries, but never by Agatha Christie. Victor Canning and Hammond Innes were always more her cup of tea. Also magazines like the Manchester Guardian and Monocle and the New York Review of Books. My father, who made a career of the Navy and ended up as a recruiter, was more the all-American type. He likes the Detroit Tigers and the Detroit Red Wings and wore a black armband the day Vince Lombardi died. No shit. And he reads those Richard Stark novels about Parker, the thief. That always amused the hell out of my mother. She finally broke down and told him that Richard Stark was really Donald Westlake, who writes sort of funny mysteries under his real name. My father tried one and hated it. After that, he always acted like Westlake Stark was his private lapdog who turned against him one night and tried to bite his throat. My earliest memory is of waking up in the dark and thinking I was dead until I saw the shadows moving on the walls and the ceiling. There was a big old elm outside my window, and the wind would move the branches. This particular night, the first night I remember anything, there must have been a full moon. Hunter's moon, do they call it? Because the walls were very bright and the shadows were very dark. The branch shadows looked like great moving fingers. Now, when I think of it, they seemed like corpse fingers. But I couldn't have thought that then, could I? I mean, I was only 3. A kid that little doesn't even know what a corpse is. But there was something coming. I could hear it. Down the hall. Something terrible was coming. Coming from me through the darkness. I could hear it. Creaking and creaking and creaking. I couldn't move. Maybe I didn't even want to move. I don't remember about that. I just lay and watched the tree fingers move on the wall and ceiling and waited for the creaking thing to get down to my room and throw open the door. After a long time, it might have been an hour or it might have only been a few seconds, I realised the creaking thing wasn't after me at all, or at least not yet. It was after Mom and Dad down the hall. The creaking thing was in Mom and Dad's room. I lay there watching the tree fingers and listened. Now the whole thing seemed so dreamy and far away, like a city must look from a mountaintop where the air is rare, but very real just the same. I can remember the wind shuffling back and forth against the glass of my bedroom window. I can remember wetting myself. It was warm and somehow comforting, and I can remember the creaking thing. After a long, long, long time, I can remember my mother's voice, out of breath and irritable and a little afraid. "Stop now, Carl!" Again the creaking furtive. "Stop it!" A mutter from my father. From my mother. "I don't care. I don't care if you didn't. Stop it and let me sleep." So I knew. I went to sleep, but I knew. The creaking thing was my father. 15. Nobody said anything. Some of them hadn't gotten the point, if there was one. I wasn't sure. They were still looking at me expectantly, as if awaiting the punchline of a rather good joke. Others were studying their hands, obviously embarrassed, but Susan Brooks looked altogether radiant and vindicated. It was a very nice thing to see. I felt like a farmer spreading shit and growing corn. Still nobody said anything. The clock buzzed away with a vague kind of determination. I looked down at Mrs. Underwood. Her eyes were half open, glazed, gummy. She looked no more important than a woodchuck I had once blown away with my father's 410. A fly was unctuously washing its paws on our forearm. Feeling a little disgusted, I waved it away. Outside, 4 more police cars had arrived. Other cars were parked along the shoulder of the highway for as far as I could see beyond the roadblock. Quite a crowd was gathering. I sat back, dry scrubbed the side of my face with my hand and looked at Ted. He held up his fists to shoulder height, smiled and popped up the middle fingers on each one. He didn't speak, but his lips moved, and I read it easily. Shit. Nobody knew it had been passed but him and me. He looked ready to speak aloud, but I wanted to just keep it between us for a little while. I said,